I would like to start with a side note that I believe is necessary. I completely agree with your concept of a souvenir photo. No photo of an artwork is the artwork itself. You mentioned more or less that the crocodile was not the crocodile. And it takes it worth remembering if one wants to stay alive. Our brain has the ability to trick us. Your work makes me reflect on this. Okay, what is art for you?
I remember this way to take really care of the photograph of works became for two reasons. At that time, which I think is late 60s, photographic elements became, for many artists, the way to transmit the work they were doing someplace else. At the very same time, I was starting to do works in the streets or wherever, outside the institution or something like that. I mean, in fact, I was even not invited, so I was using what was possible to be used, and Paris was a very nice city to do that. And at the very beginning, I make impossible to reproduce any picture of the work because I knew it will be transformed into something else. And then I realized also that without making any documentation, we'd become a little bit like a mystification of the work itself. And the work was existing. The problem was to do not be confused, speaking about the picture, with the work itself, and to always put back the intention for anyone who would be interested to go to see the work. So then I used the idea of a photo souvenir when I was able, or when people asked to have a picture in a catalog or in a book or whatsoever. With this idea, you just took this example to really make absolutely sure people understand that this photo, it's a souvenir, and it has no big, is almost very little connection with the reality. That's why I took the the example of the crocodile or an example of someone from your family. Of course, the person can be out of this world since many years, and the photo will never make that person back again. So we know it's a big difference between the souvenir we can see and the person itself. In the art system, it's a long, long time the thing is completely erased. Many works, which in fact are works mainly done, I don't speak for painting or sculpture or things like that, which are more or less visible and permanent, but for many experimentation which was done at the in the late 60s and continue to be done, often pictures of these works are like a work, definitively work of art in the walls of the museum. So, first of all, I think it's wrong. Second of all, I don't think I should get to that trap. And then I never show, or if it's happening, it's absolutely outside of my control. And as soon as I know it, I do everything possible to have it absolutely rejected from the place. But you normally will never see a picture installed like a frame or whatsoever in the walls of a museum or a gallery. And of course, the documentation exists, and we should do the best effort possible to keep it like a documentation, which is, okay, you have a little image of something which is still existing, you can go to see it if you are very interested, or this work has been destroyed because it was there for 3 months or 6 months and now it's out. So I get always a big distance with the use of the photo to never make the photo replacing the work. And I keep that active up to date.
If you agree, I would like to talk about the social aspect of your work. I have the feeling that if your stripes are your visual tool, your on-site installation are your tool of awareness. Tools to generate questions. What is this? But is this art? Questions on questions. Does your work aspire to foster a critically engaged citizen?
I mean, I do my best not to force anything to begin with. So when a work is done, it's a little bit like a gift. In other words, people can do with such a gift exactly what they want to do. It's completely free from me, and it's usually not giving too many direction. When I said that, for example, most of the work, if you take the public works, they don't have one way to be seen. They have 100 ways to be seen, and they are all good or bad, but they are all the choice of who is going to look at that. So more a work has different entries, I think more the work can be interesting. And some of these entries can be also contradictory, but they are open. So if people choose this way or this way, which maybe is not the one I will like or will prefer, it's totally given, totally open. After that, they have to think about what means such a way to look to a work, and then what happening in their whole sensibility or mind from what they catch from the angle of view they decided, or even from 20 different angles, which normally will work automatically with the work. It's not one way to see it, it's several ways, and each time the perspective, the the view from a big distance or the view when you are really inside give you a very different feeling. But no one of these possibilities is the best or the only one. And this is completely, to my mind, under the hands and spirit of who is going to look to the work.
Yeah. The point of view is crucial in your work. The philosopher, Derrida, says, this is a difficult question. The philosopher Derrida says that everything we have thought in philosophy has a limitation because we have thought them through languages. We think using words. I wonder if art is also a tool to philosophize beyond words or images.
I think it's a good question. I really personally think and hope. If not, I think we lost a lot of interest and let's say the visual work whatsoever, which get into the category of art or another one, because for me these categories are not even sometimes valid. As to speak for itself. In other words, I think, which I will consider like a fantastic painting or a fantastic work whatsoever, the dimension, but visual must speak for itself. And automatically, in speaking, I am wrong. So the description of the fact you can only understand something like, let's say, the painting, by the words we are going to put around this painting, it can be interesting, can be intelligent, etc., etc. But I think the painting itself, as we can say, with the difficulty to make it clear, the word to speak. And these are absolutely out of the language and the way we perceive a lot of things, because the language, of course, helps to do most of the way of thinking and exchange, etc., etc. So the paint and visual art, I think, is something which transmits something by itself, but not by the help of words. And I'm absolutely sure it does the same with music, which need not very few words. Music is not in need of some speech or some... it doesn't prevent anyone to speak about and people to write or to make philosophy from an art piece or a music thing. But I think these category of expression have their way to speak. In other words, I often, I work with that since many, many years, but one of the reasons I do use a lot the field of color is because basically the color cannot be described. It's not existing. It's so clear in certain language, like for example in the Greenland or place like that, where they have to define the snow like 100 or 200 words with all the little difference from the snow in the morning, the snow in the afternoon, the snow in the summer, etc., 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 which for people who are not having this in their language, it's totally reduced to maybe white, and that's all. Nothing's very special. But so depending of the culture, the people have had invented words very, very fine or very defined to express something which, of course, they try to see the best way to give and to exchange with other people. But when you see, let's say, the fantastic work that I cannot mention, there are so many paintings like that, but take especially works by Pollock or a work by Monet, any description is absolutely meaningless compared to what you see. And what you see is giving something which is totally out of the word exchanges and the way we express ourselves to do many, many things. Most of the things we are doing, the words are there to explain, to support, to contradict, etc., etc. But what we can maybe said a beautiful or very strong work of art doesn't need the words. And when you go back to the idea of color, for myself it's really evident, because only to see directly in front of you something which might look red, what is really meaning will be more or less special for every people looking to that red. And if you just said, yes, this work is red, and maybe you can imagine the work which is not right under your eyes, I think such a thing is totally impossible, because you cannot explain what red you speak about, and you don't even can see or understand what and how is the red the people you are in front of you are going to conceive. The only thing is the real red which is there, and that is completely outside of words. Not so easy to explain, but the reduction of that will say that the word we put on color are more or less totally meaningless.
Yeah, it's the significance of a word is different in different people.
Yeah, exactly, but not the significant. The material itself. I cannot imagine how you see the same color we see together might be very different. But we cannot explain, because the words are totally capable to make this expression. You look to, take a dictionary, look to red, and they will start to say the red like a cherry or something like that. And you will go to cherry, and they will say the cherry is red. Okay, so where are you going with that? Nowhere. So you don't describe that. In the cannot, it's impossible.
Then and Now was by far the worst title I could think of for this talk. And that's why I choose it. I would like to describe the wall Buren, the wall before Buren, the landscape of those years of May '68. How was the wall before Buren's stripe?
I think it's, it's difficult to have a perception of that. I think it was a big change, speaking in general, which happened very rarely in a century. I think it was a big change, internationally speaking, at the turn of the 60s, and not only with visual art. So I really think that many artists of that time changed, more or less stronger, but really changed what was the situation of art in general just before that. And I guess in the 20th century, we have had a big change. I don't like the word the revolution, but a big change in the turn of the century, and especially at the beginning of the 20th century, with a lot of different artists, extremely different, but every one of these artists changed, I can say, change the map. It's another type of work which was then coming inside the conscience of the people. Also, when you look to the real dates, sometimes it's interesting because the fame of the artist or these people is not at all coming at one point all together. So at one point you have someone who is very well known and someone which is totally unknown. And I will take the example, for example, in the early 1920s, you were having, with absolutely very little knowledge by the other people of their existence, someone like Claude Monet in France, and someone like Malevich. Okay, you immediately get a little image. They are not really doing the same thing, but they are both of them doing something almost like a complete change of the way to use and to work and to make possibility for painting, speaking about this special category, completely different than before. Monet, which turned more or less to be abstract and as a work with colors absolutely amazing at the end of his life, and Malevich, which is more or less completely breaking a certain aspect of painting with, for example, the black square on the white hand or whatsoever. So this is already showing a big change. At the same time, we know perfectly that today, but at the time of that change, Monet was certainly much more well-known than Malevich, but they both push where was the painting situation of the Western world, at least, in a way which was completely different as anything before. And this really opened something for the rest of the century. And I think that in the 60s, we have had the same kind of phenomena with many people from the early or mid-60s up to the beginning of the 70s who really changed a lot of things in art, like if it was for some people like a joke, for others very serious, for others interesting. Anyhow, it was a big change. And you have some, let's say, example of that. If you just look to photography, back to photography, documentation of what was an exhibition before the Second War and just after or whatsoever, you can see that they all look the same. Of course, they are not showing the same stuff, but they look the same. And in the late 60s, you look to any documentation of exhibition, and it's another story. So even the most superficial formality, speaking about what can be an exhibition, it's completely different. If you take that period between 1910 and 1920 and what's happening after that, and then our looks exhibition of the living works done by artists after the 60s. And I think we are still in this move up to date. But so the explosion, in a way, was happening more or less in the same period. So, of course, each one of the people who were part of this explosion made a trace or made something which either make sense, either open the door to very different works, which is coming also later on, or just we are doing something irrelevant. So you have all that, but this big movement was, at least in the Western world, was really like a huge wave. We changed a lot of things. To begin with, even change the museum. So we have had also, after everything being extremely connected, even if it's not directly with the same story, but the explosion of place to exhibit, speaking about museum, came around the early, mid-70s. So after the big move from all these artists doing anything from works in the desert up to new type of paintings or whatsoever, then the way to show it were more or less designed by an explosion of a museum, and then not only in the Western world, but in the entire world. So that's something which is, for me, an invention, in a way, which is as strong as the invention of oil painting when oil painting was invented. And we know perfectly that oil painting changed really in a very strong way what the artists were able to do with paint. And it's like, by itself, something coming from the technology which changed really the way to do painting, which was supposed to be not really attached to the technology of how to make something in a surface or whatsoever. So after this big movement by many different artists in the 60s, we have had a real revolution about the construction of hundreds of museums around the world. And for me, even if I don't know exactly in which way it's going, such a thing, it's so strong that it has an effect on the production of the work. And it's also so new, because you can look all the 20th century. The first museum, it's around 1930, with the very first museum, it's interesting, was done by artists in Poland. That's the very first museum before the MoMA in New York. And then you have the MoMA, and then you have like that 2 or 3 museums, and that's all, up to the 70s. And then thousands of museums everywhere, and it's still doing that. If you especially look to China, for example, where they build a museum every month.
It's through conversations with collectors and patrons that I've often come across the notion that you don't really own the artwork. At best, you're its custodian. How do you determine the ownership structure or form of your artwork?
I built something when I really started to work in the mid-60s, which was thinking about the future, the very close future of what's happening with what I am doing if it's not anymore under my hands. So I built a kind of, how to say it, I don't like the word, but at least comprehensible, a kind of certificate to be sure we know about what we are speaking about, as soon as the work is not anymore under the hand of the person who did it. So I think it was quite important because we know all the system. For example, and let's say what is the most happening, if you have a painting somewhere in front or on the back, that makes no difference. The artist is putting his name, his signature. So this is the proof it's done by X or Z. That's the most simple, and that's really what we know since, not since thousands of years, but at least since 400 or 500 years. At one point, the artist decided to put their name. Before that, it was also rare. But the work was also different and whatsoever. I'm not even at all an historian, but just very, very superficially, we know that. And as far as I was doing works with, where I refused to sign or to give any kind of personal sign, to be sure, this is a person who is doing that, etc., I invented a kind of certificate which will decide that this work, with a description, very easy to do, when especially at the beginning it was just like a piece of linen with something painted. With that description, this certificate was giving to anyone who was making some money to buy the work, to be able to be sure it was done by myself, and also to be able to be eventually resold, because even if we can speak a long time about this system of exchange and buying and all the thing which has to do with the commerce of the art, as for potatoes, so we have to be not ashamed about that. This is also part of the way we exchange works of art. We can dream about something with such a thing will not exist, but I don't see yet how it can be forgotten. So anyhow, that gives a possibility to exchange, and it's a little more complicated because starting from the point that I am still really believing the value, the economical value of a work has almost nothing to do with the aesthetic or ethic or both of the work, which means the only value, economical value of a work is how much someone is ready to buy such a work. It's nothing to do with the talent or whatsoever of who did the work. So most of the time, we have the feeling if work from Picasso, it's really expensive, it's also because Picasso, it's extraordinary. It's certainly not far from the truth, but it's especially want to said who is going to make so much money for this type of work. And so, coming back to my little paper, the agreement of what to do with this material which was existing and which could be exchanged, the way to show it. It cannot be just put someplace in a room. It has to follow some rule, etc., etc. It's under the acceptance and also the interest of who is buying the work. And so this paper, which I said I don't like the name, but I call, let's say, certificate, it's also signed by who is buying. So if you just want to go quickly about the full process, since now 55 or almost 60 years, in a way I am collecting the signature of who buy my work. And they are collecting.
Okay.
But that's just to speak about this problem. It's not said it's better or worse or whatsoever, but it's because this problem is really also part of what an artist can do, because, okay, what he does, or she does, it's something, but then when it starts to be more in the world, and one way to be more in the world outside of just exhibiting, it's also to get under the hand of different people. It's extremely important, and I think to just see how you deal as an artist with this kind of exchange is as almost important as the work itself. So I don't want to go further because it's a very complicated system, but so far I never was having trouble to recognize if a work was done by myself or if that is a forgery. And at the beginning of my work, as far as all the works were more or less for 5 years always the same, it's a big challenge, to be sure. And when I said always the same, it's also something that anyone can do. So it was having very big difficulty to say, oh, but this is really done by him and not by somebody else. It's a little tricky. So that's also the reason I invented this kind of connection, to be able to recognize, let's say, the life of this object.
In 1971, the Guggenheim in New York decided to remove your work the day before the opening due to protest from artists like Judd and Flavin. In 2005, an epic exhibition titled The Eye of the Storm, Works in Situ by Daniel Buren, seemed like a form of apology. What did you feel in that moment? You know, I'm going to do something about this, about that exhibition. I'm going to do something that the people say, don't do it, don't do it. I'm going to say a joke when I have seen the photos of that exhibition, and I saw the painting of Judd and the rest of the artists, and I saw your black stripes from the roof.
They were blue.
Blue, okay. I saw in black and white the photo, and when I saw that, I was laughing alone, and I was thinking about a joke. Todo el mundo dice, no hagas un chiste, y menos en inglés, pero lo voy a hacer. I'm going to do it. I'm going to say this joke. I was remember a joke of the Chaperon Rouge, Caperucita Roja, when she was walking, and she saw a flower. So, oh, a flower, how beautiful! La 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 rita, la 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 rita. Oh, another flower, how beautiful! And then go walk again and say, fuck, a mushroom. This is the feeling when I saw the surprise to see a so different artwork in that exhibition. How do you felt in that moment?
I think it's a lot of things which were intrigued all together. First of all, it was the name of the show was 6th International Guggenheim. At that time, it's 1970 when they prepared the exhibition, opening, I think, in January 71. At the very same time, for the living production of, let's say, the art, we were already having in Europe a lot of extremely interesting group exhibition. And we were not even calling it international, but they were. So it was at least more or less always like 40–45% of artists from America and 50–55% from Europe, and few people from Japan maybe and South America, but mostly that was America and Europe. And that was already working just after 68. That was the very first big exhibition. And in America at that time, it was totally out of the game. They were not having big shows like that. And most of the American artists of this, as I said before, this kind of boom of the 60s, were able to work quite well and quite a lot in Europe, but almost never in America, because it was not in their interest. So this international, maybe first of importance in America, was already a very strange balance, but all that has to be known. So that was an exhibition with 20 or 25 artists, quite reduced, which is pretty interesting also. And it was 5 people from Europe and all the rest from America. So what they were, calling international was in fact American and few little guy to look not American 100%. So that is a big difference on the spirit, etc. And the people, like always, this is not new, you have always at certain period some artists who are dominant physically, dominant by the work, by their fame, whatsoever, all together. And in the very early 70s, the people who were really dominant in the States were the minimalists, and especially people like Judd and Levin and Bob Morris and all this group of people. So they were quite strong. So I was part of the European. We were 5, so we were almost meaningless, and most of us who are all pretty well known today, we are totally unknown. So that's make also immediately a balance where you can imagine the worst. Because anyone who wants to use his power was able to use it with absolutely no conflict. So what I did, just in 2 words for the people who never saw any picture, was to use one of the characteristics of the Guggenheim, which was, of course, his architecture. And funny enough, it was never touched before since the building of the Guggenheim, and I hang up a piece of linen from the very top under the cupola up to like 3 meters before the floor, not to be touched or to be disrupting what they can show on the floor. So this, for me, was playing with a lot of aspects which I was really interested, not at all to show something on a wall by itself, but to show something which was possible to use the architecture to be visible all around, climbing or coming down, and also a space, not for that reason, but in fact, it was never used before. I think before the only work which were installed in the middle was 2 or 3 years before, a piece from Calder. That's all. So, just to make it, which looks funny today, a kind of originality of using the space. And as you know, which is always true, for any group show, it's always a kind of a little fight or big fight between the artists to have the best place or to use the best space. So that's part of the game before we do a group show. And then I was invited, and very rare already for me at that time, which is always the same even today when I am invited in a show, not only to be exclusive, but also because I don't know myself. I usually don't know what I will do, so I cannot give a project. In that time, the Guggenheim asked to each people what was their intention for the show. And I gave my intentions, so they agree with it. It's important for the following of the story. So the museum agree with it. They pay for the making of the piece, which was really not expensive, but at least it was 20 meters high by 10 meters long, that you can imagine the way to construct the piece was quite something. And the transport from Paris to New York. So this was really part of the show in the concept of the people who were the authority to do the exhibition. Then everyone worked to install his work, or yes. So for 1 week, most of the invited artists were there to install one thing there, etc., etc. And the day before the opening, everything was more or less done, and I remember I left the place around 3 p.m., and we were supposed to have a drink with only the participants and their friends or helpers, like at 7 p.m., this very same day before the public opening. And so I left with my work right in the middle of the museum, and I came back at 7, and it was like usual, empty. So you can imagine I was quite shocked to arrive to the thing and to do not see my work, and trying to know what did happen. And then they explained, you know, it was very bad for some artists. They feel like we were not able to see their work anymore, which was absolutely untrue. And then we decided to take it away. That's all. And again, I will make a little comparison. At that time, such a thing will have never happened in Europe. But in America, it was very open. We do a censure. They don't want it. And then I look a little deeper. All the participants signed a petition to say, we want to see this work back as it was invited, with no comment, and it was signed by everyone except the 3 people who were against. And so they, again, back to their fame at that time and strength, etc., they succeed to push the museum to fire me from the museum. And in fact, to try to be a little softer, they said, but you know, we know it's a little strange, etc., but we will compensate such a thing, and we will offer to you a one-man exhibition after the show. And if I want to give a little more details, then I realized that I left the place without even taking a picture. So I did a work which was enormous, which I think will have made a lot of question for the public, etc., etc. And I was left with strictly nothing, even not a picture, to say, you know, I did something, it was special, but it's not there anymore. Which in fact was perfect, I mean, censure. Philosophically speaking, I think censure is something terrible because the censure always wins. And in that case, the censorship of the thing was winning 100%. Plus the fact no one knew even my name or my work, and I was European, so I was absolutely meaningless in this exhibition. And so I accepted, quite in a strong reflex immediately. I said, okay, I will accept, but then I need, when the museum is closed, I will need to reinstall the work because I want absolutely to have a catalog, and then I need the picture. And they accepted. So in one day where I think that was the Monday that time, museum being closed, we reinstalled the piece, which in fact it's a gigantic piece, but it was extremely simple to be done, you know. One cable, then we pull the little rings inside this cable, and we leave the linen coming down, and the piece was installed. So it was maybe 15 minutes work and even less to go out. So we reinstalled the work. I took the picture. We cleaned it completely. And then I was having few documents which I use with the help of the galleries I was working with at that time, and they were all from Europe. So we did a lot of sending and message, etc., to make the work visible at least through the picture, and then to explain, okay, they were not pleased, and search, use their power to make that away, and to leave it to the public to as much as possible. And in fact, this picture did make a big effect, and people were normally not understanding how they could have lived such a work which was invited, etc. So, and immediately when I get the picture, I said, of course, I refuse totally to do an exhibition after this one to show my work. So the work was never shown. So that's the paradox of the full censure of this piece, which is rather well known because of these pictures, which has been transmitted through many different books and catalogs, but one was never seen except by the few people working to install the exhibition at that time. And when they invite me after many years to make a show, so again, it was still named the Guggenheim Museum, but you can imagine 30 years later, I think, even more, it was not the same people. So it was still the same institution, but not the same people. So we did this exhibition, and I was thinking, what can I do? I will use this opportunity to show this work again, etc. And after a few thinking about, I decided that it was really a bad idea. And so this piece was never directly visible ever so far. And I did something very different when you saw the show at the Guggenheim. So that was the story. And I think the bad gesture from these two artists, from who I'm still for many of the work, really interested by their work. And at that time, I think I was even more interested by the work. Of course, a big mistake. And I think this mistake was basically psychological. I think they were unable to stand something more visible than their work in their home and done by an unknown artist coming from Europe. And for some people here who might have read many texts by Donald Judd, who did write a lot about art, about what he does, and about the full situation, you can really understand. I compare a little bit the text of Judd, which are extremely nationalistic and ego-centralized, a little bit about what we saw later on, and we are unfortunately still seeing today, by the way to speak and the way to fight and the way to say stupidity by Donald Trump. So that gives you an idea. And so everything can be a little bit understood, and I think did a mistake, because even when I forgot this story, because luckily I was able to work and to continue to work, they were always questioned, said, but why did you fire this artist in 1971 from the show? And they were always saying, we did nothing, that's the museum who fired this artist, which of course was a complete it was true on the paper, but completely a lie. They push the museum to make my work out. So that's the story, a little bit.
Could you tell us about the special relationship with Mexico? About your special relationship with Mexico. Could we see again the photos without sound?
I mean, I have had a very personal story in Mexico. So that's one of the places I really love the best in the world. I was, in fact, very, very young. I did a study on the murals from the Mexican artist. I was 18 years old, and I left to Mexico with very little money. That was a kind of a grant given for very young people in France at that time. And so I left for 3 months, and I worked in manufacture in Mexico for 1 month, and then for 1 month I traveled around Mexico, and I also tried to really see with my eyes what these people were doing. And I was being very, very impressed and very interested, even if the work, as you know, is extremely realistic and figurative, etc. But the full spirit behind was extremely interesting to learn. That was the first break in the 20th century from the School of Paris. So being Parisian, of course, I knew a little bit the School of Paris, and with my little position, which was almost not yet existing, I was really, really critical about what we were calling the School of Paris. But I never saw that it was a full group of artists. For most of them who came, like almost any artist in the world at that time, to work in Paris and to see the people living there and working there, etc. From Diego Rivera or you can mention any other of these muralists. And they came back in Mexico at the time of the revolution, and then they took part of that revolution. And they built what was, in this context, extremely interesting, which was to use their talent, or the fact of what they were already doing in a kind of a small painting, on the wall of the monument, and everywhere a little bit official, all around Mexico. And they were so famous, and they were also invited right away by people in America to do huge murals in Detroit or in New York or in the South, more in the South, which are still visible today. And of course, at one point, they become to be so clearly, even in their painting, like a very famous one in Detroit, where they made the portrait of the big communist figure from Russia, then they were definitely fine to be invited in America. But anyhow, their concept and the way they were working, outside of the fact which was really comprehensive, but of course outside of any kind of connection, let's say at least in Europe, was also to educate the people they wanted to be more free, etc., with these images. So most of these people were not able to read or to write. And of course, these huge murals were used as a way to learn the Mexican history by people who never get to school, etc. So all these contexts was for me quite interesting to see, and especially it was something else existing in the art world outside of the School of Paris. And of course, after you start to discover more and more that even if that school was dominant, it was a lot of things happening even in Europe, everywhere. Anyhow, after that, I never get back to Mexico for many, many years. And I was so, not nostalgic, because it's maybe not in my temperament, but really like a mark. And I did not want to go back any time there unless to work right in the country. And 20 years ago or something like that, I was invited to work. And strangely enough, my love for Mexico, which I was in going there back 40 years later, I was thinking to be expecting something very disagreeable or something which changed so much. So in fact, when I get back there, the change was enormous. Mexico was 5 times bigger, everything was different, and I fell in love again with something very different. So anytime I have the possibility to work in Mexico, it's a place where I am very happy to try to do something.
Thank you. That was my last question.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.